I agree with all that. I think what Justin's doing is absolutely terrific. But I just throw in a couple of caveats, just things to think about. I wish I was as confident as you that the truth catches up quickly, and I go with the old, I tend to believe the old saw, which has been attributed to a few different people, and you can Google it and judge for yourself which one you think actually deserves this, but and that deserves credit for it, but that is that a lie makes it halfway around the world before the truth can get its pants on. And that, so in some renditions of the quote, it's a lie makes it halfway around the world before the truth can get its boots on, but I prefer the pants. But it can sometimes be very hard for the truth to catch up, and it's a particular problem in the early hours of an emergency, a crime. We might think about the Boston Marathon bombings, natural disaster, a shooting. The early reports, and anybody here, you know, who's been in the business knows this, the early reports are almost always wrong. I mean, just the other day with the typhoon, the early casualty figure was 10,000 dead. You saw that, you know, online early on. Might end up being that, but right now it's about 3,500. So almost invariably, those early reports are wrong. So I think it's incumbent on editors and the people who are managing this terrific citizen journalism to keep reinforcing that point and to keep using words like, you know, here is an unconfirmed eyewitness account. Here's some video that has not been, very interesting, we're showing it to you, posting it, but it has not been authenticated, you know. And to keep throwing those things in there just so that people do have that skepticism that professional journalists do, but that most people don't have, and that can give, I think, allow this trend to grow as, you know, as we've heard, it will grow, but to grow in a healthy way.
It's also important, I'm sorry. I think it's also important to make clear that the word blogger and the description of somebody as a blogger needs to have multiple components of its definition. The fact that I wake up in the morning and decide to blog is a lot different than you as blogger devoting an enormous amount of time and energy to verification and fact gathering and so on and so forth. And it tends to happen in discussions like this, it already happened today, where someone made a distinction between journalist and blogger, when in fact a blogger can be just as much a journalist as somebody who works for an established enterprise. Thus, your model.
Thank you.
I think if I may, Bob, as the union guy up here, I think I'm going to inject a little note of reality. Well, nuts and bolts anyway, and that is that when we're looking at the citizen journalism as opposed to that which is practiced by a workforce, a paid workforce of journalists, which we've been the beneficiaries of in this country for generations. I think I look at, right now, our industry, the news business is in turmoil. The business model that we've relied on for generations isn't working anymore. The owners of publishers and anybody else who's looking to make a buck in the business are flailing about trying to find a new model. We hope the Times paywall works. There are all kinds of startups up there that are relying on grants. That's not much of a business model, but if it works for the present, that's great. But really, when you have the kind of turmoil that we're having, and you have a loss of jobs in the news business, and you have declining revenues in the news business, I look at, if there's a void, as Heather just said, and you have citizen journalists who rush to fill that void, I think that's a good thing for society. I think that brings us news coverage where we otherwise would not have had it. But to the degree that you have the owners of news media outlets who who are losing revenues and looking to cut costs any way they can. And if they can get free news, if they can get, if they can tap into citizen journalists and use them and displace paid journalists, I think that's a bad thing for society. I think those people who have made a commitment to make a living out of this are more committed to news reporting than those who do it because they've been inspired to and they're doing it in their spare time. You're not likely to spend as much of your life at it. You're not likely to be as committed to it. I think we benefit as a society from having a workforce of journalists with wages that can sustain them throughout a career. And I don't know exactly whether the rise of citizen journalists is a cause of the loss of jobs in the news business or the result of the loss of jobs in the news business. I suspect it's somewhat of a vicious cycle, but I just wouldn't be all that. I don't know that I'm all that hip hip hooray about it, because I do have a few concerns about, we do need a workforce of paid journalists who are committed to news gathering in this country if we want the kind of society we've had.
Especially if there's not this distinction, I mean, this is a really important point. There has to be a big distinction between Justin and the people who are giving him reports from the Jersey Shore that they just witnessed when they were out for a drive. They're not the same, whether paid or unpaid. So Justin is functioning as a journalist, and the ones who are feeding him are functioning as essentially as sources who now have much greater ease of entry into the bloodstream of media. And that's just a technological function. But there is a continued, and there will always be a role for experienced journalists, whether they are paid or unpaid. I'm reminded of what my friend Michael Kinsley, a great journalist, has said, that when he goes into a restaurant, he wants the food prepared by the chef, not by the person at the next table. That's why he's going to the restaurant. So you, through your experience, you've now become a chef. And whether it would be better for everybody in this room, better for the institution of journalism in general, if you could find a way to make money off of it and be paid. But the main distinction is between somebody who has applied the certain standards of a craft and those who are the sources of that journalist.
My line would be, we don't want citizen dentists.
Right.
But I want to correct or challenge something just said a moment ago, and that is the notion that there is some relationship between citizen engagement in journalism and loss of jobs. That's preposterous. There is no relationship between quote-unquote citizen journalism, citizen participation, and loss of jobs. You nailed it at the beginning of your comments. It's about the economic model, but it has nothing to do with the fact that we're engaging people in this in new and different ways.
Well, when you sit across the table from employers and they tell you how they have to make cuts because of the declining revenues, and they're looking for any way to fill a void in their news gathering ability, I'm not so sure that, if that alternative wasn't there, I don't know what they would do. But the fact that there are people, and I'm not just speaking about citizen journalists, I'm talking about people willing to work for free in general, or it offers a convenient alternative for employers, and if it's a result of the upheaval of the business model, that's one thing. But obviously, employers want to make more money, and once they are in that mode of looking to cut costs, I'm just not so sure they're going to stop.
Especially Merrill, where I think you're mistaken, at least is in my corner of journalism and punditry, where when Huffington Post and lots of other publications can get smart columns for free, the market value of punditry just plummets, which it has. So, for instance, the most that the New Yorker will pay for a commentary piece on their website is $250. The New York Times fee for an op-ed piece has been the same for 15 years. In fact, I think it's actually lower than it used to be. And so people's willingness to comment for free means considerably less work for commentators, and I think the same thing would probably start to apply just on basic market principles to reporting.
I'm kind of going to throw a question back. Isn't what Justin does, reporting during a hurricane, whose house was just blown away, or who doesn't have electric power, or needs food or water, whatever the issue might be, and a journalist who might be then covering in depth how the Sandy money, federal funds are being spent? I mean, isn't there a difference between these two things? They're not one and the same.
Absolutely.
Justin does cover, you can.
Sure. I mean, I may not do the type of, deeper journalism on a day-to-day basis. But I have, from the sources that I have, developed over the past few years, I've gotten, some pretty, I've gotten information that regular day-to-day, reporters, maybe for the Star-Ledger, Aztec Press, et cetera, may not have gotten. So in that vein, yes, it is different since I do deal with a lot of real time, but I have written a lot of more, in-depth stories that deal with information that is coming, directly from my sources who have, supplied me with information because they have a sense of comfort with me.
And I'm going to move on,
Thank you.
Justin, to the... We've just been talking about different models, and we're going to do sort of a 180-degree turn on models here. When Dr. Uchenna Ekwo was head of the Nigeria Union of Journalists in the 1990s, you couldn't be a journalist, I don't know if that's still true in Nigeria, without a 4-year university degree in journalism. And Peter, you wear two hats. You work Deadline Club is a professional organization, Newspaper Guild is a union. Uchenna kind of headed up both, so I'm going to invite him up here. He's going to educate us a little bit about what it's like in Nigeria to enforce both ethics and work standards.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bob, what we didn't discuss was when we were talking about who is a journalist, and I'm beginning to really think why a lot of people want to be journalists. I remember in 2008, William Taft is a communication scholar when he spoke at the bicentennial celebration of Missouri School of Journalism. He spoke about why really journalism is important and perhaps the most important profession in the world. He listed a lot of professions, like all of us, when we die, some of us who believe in God, we expect to go to heaven. And when you get to heaven, you don't need a military man because there won't be any war in heaven. You don't need a medical doctor because everybody will be fine and well, no sick person will be there. You don't need a builder because everyone will be accommodated in God's mansion. You don't need a teacher. You don't need any profession, but journalism you do need because people who live in the northern part of heaven want to know what's happening in the southern part of heaven. And those who live in the west want to know what's happening in the east. So I found that interesting. It looks really funny, really. But I guess that's why perhaps you don't want to go to heaven because you want to be a journalist. So I can understand why there is so much interest in becoming a journalist. Having said that, let me just try to be brief because I know that we don't have enough time. I had wanted to prepare an elaborate discussion, but we don't have time. When I was in leadership of journalism in Nigeria in the 90s, yeah, there could be some changes, but not so much changes. We got involved, I just brought this. this is the code of ethics of journalists in Nigeria, prepared by Nigeria Press Council. Because the way it operated then, it still operates actually, what we call Nigerian Press Organization. You have Nigerian Press Council, the Nigerian Union of Journalists. Actually, Bob? Okay. Okay. So you have the Nigerian Press Council, Nigerian Press Organization is made up of Nigerian Press Council. Nigerian Press Council regulates the practice of journalism, in terms of who even becomes a member. As a matter of fact, what perhaps we might call in the United States licensing of journalists. I was involved in 1992 in the accreditation of journalists, because what happened in the past was that a lot of people could just come and answer journalism. I mean, he's a journalist, he's that, and all that. So we needed to really quarantine, as it were, the profession as it were, by making sure that for you to practice journalism, as at that time, we made it really that you have to have a diploma approved by the Nigerian Union of Journalists. And that diploma will require you to go, even if you are practicing and maybe you had a degree in philosophy, they were expected to go to any of the higher institutions to do a diploma. It could be a 1-year or 9-month program. Then you now be recognized and issued an ID card by the Nigerian Union of Journalists. And the Nigerian Press Council, press organization, like I said, you have Nigerian Press Council, the Nigerian Union of Journalists, Nigerian Guild of Editors, and Newspaper Proprietors Association of Nigeria. So this purposely for the print journalism. You also have similar regulations in the broadcast media. And this, let me see, the National Broadcasting Commission, an equivalent of the Nigerian Press Council. And you have the Broadcasting Organization of Nigeria and Independent Broadcasting Association of Nigeria. Before 1992, we didn't have private television or broadcasting organizations in Nigeria. It was in 1992 that it was deregulated. We now had, a lot of radio and television stations that were private. Previously, it was really, okay, like when I worked in Radio Nigeria, for example, I worked in Radio Nigeria for 12 years. If I did a news analysis, we had about 85 million listeners at a time, because all the other state stations will hook up to us at major news bells, like 7 o'clock in the morning, 4 p.m., and 10 p.m. And Nigeria is about 160 million people. So you can imagine the kind of audience we had. But now everything is fragmented. And even now, we keep on asking who is a journalist. We have a lot of all these social media and all that. So I'm not sure we will be as influential as we used to be those days, So, and that is one other thing I also wanted to look at. Look at, when you compare a few things that happen also, even in the US here and the United, like in most emerging countries, it can be very interesting. I'm not sure any journalist, Obama will be able to fight any journalist if you ask him a very nerve-wracking or a question that he doesn't like. Is it possible? I don't think so. But we had a situation where a former head of state, for example, I remember those days. One guy, we later worked together in African Independent Television, the independent media that came up at a point. So this guy just asked a question, and the head of state took the microphone and broke it like that. Can you imagine that? Picture such a situation in the United States, what will happen? And I also want to talk about how somehow the NUJ also enforces or tries to regulate, because there are some people who go, I think I read sometime in CNN, some people who go and exploit some individuals claiming to be journalists, because somehow, if you appeared on television, it was a big thing, right? Or on newspapers and all that. And for someone to make it to appear on that kind of thing, maybe that's a lot, and it can give you some mileage. And some people claim to be what they are not, extorting money from people. So these are part of the things where we need to also regulate some of this practice then. Because if somehow you are not aware that you have to ask someone about his ID before he interviews you, you got to know about that. And this ID, we try to customize in such a way that, you can tell me that somehow, did we achieve 100%? No. But somehow we try to provide some benchmarks or some security features that made it impossible for you to even duplicate some of these things and fake that. So this is kind of brutality that perhaps exists in some emerging countries. And these things are not familiar here. And the question I want to...
Oh, that's it.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
The question I really want to pose, what I wanted to talk about, and perhaps of course, we can also share that. Do you think that the definition of journalism is specific to time and culture? Is it time and culture specific? In other words, who becomes a journalist, like in the United States, where First Amendment is, probably gives everyone a license to be a journalist, right? As opposed to other cultures where these things cannot just be like that. So I'm asking the question, is definition of who is a journalist time and culture specific? I yield. Thank you.
I'd like to try to address this a little bit. First of all, I can understand why Nigerian or other officials would want to see an ID, particularly in a violent political culture. There are examples of people posing as journalists. In 2001, shortly before 9/11, Al-Qaeda posed as a journalist, and they killed the leader of the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan. So these things, in an interview, these things can happen. But short of that, I object to, with all due respect to Nigeria and to their traditions, I object to almost everything that is part of the Nigerian definition of a journalist, starting with requiring a degree. Many of our finest journalists, just to pick one example, Carl Bernstein, who along with Bob Woodward uncovered the Watergate scandal in the United States, never graduated from college. Many, many examples of terrific journalists who went to what we call the College of Hard Knocks. They learned through experience how to be a good journalist and a good reporter, and it's a terrible mistake to put up that kind of, to require a sheepskin in order to be a journalist, to require a degree. I think in any country it's a terrible mistake. And as to whether they can vary, and generally most of these rules are just put up by governments in order to maintain more control over the flow of information. There was an effort in the United Nations that fortunately was defeated about 20 years ago to create what they called a new international information order. And that was essentially, they were saying, well, we don't all have to go with the American or the Western European way of, a free press. We can, there's other cultural ways of doing that. It was all just a big excuse to prevent governments from being criticized by people in their own countries. So there are universal values at stake here. Free expression is a universal value, and it's in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and it was accepted by the United Nations. These basic press freedoms during the creation of the United Nations. So I don't think that cultural differences cut very much, at least in my mind, when it comes to making judgments on these issues. And I think that we have a cliche, the proof is in the pudding. If the antidote to offensive speech is more speech, it's not a series of regulations, restrictions, barriers to entry that prevent certain people from expressing themselves. So I'm very much in the let 1,000 flowers bloom category, and until journalists, do things that show them to be bad actors, unethical, in which case the community can kind of say unofficially, don't trust this person. Short of that, I think to have governments or even governing institutions.
Actually, it's not governments.
But even institutions that can easily be influenced by the government, to be doing too much regulation of their own members, I think is ultimately going to restrict the flow of information. That's just my view.
Doesn't this go back, though, to the earlier presentation we had about the SHIELD law, which is attempting to create definitions that will have legal standing about who is a journalist and who isn't, and the whole caveat in there about being employed, working for a professional organization, all that is being debated in the context of authentication and validation and a set of rules that at the federal level merit debate. And you were making those points, Professor, and maybe you can elaborate on that, how you assess that issue in the SHIELD law discussion.
Well, I think some people object to shield laws on the grounds that it amounts to a kind of licensing, that because you have to come up with a definition, you are therefore sort of recognizing certain individuals as, you know, members of the press and others individuals as not, and that therefore you're licensing. I don't buy that argument. I mean, you're licensing, you're defining them only with respect to this one privilege. I suppose, you know, we could imagine a slippery slope in which, you know, we create a definition of journalist in the context of having a privilege not to testify, and then we expand upon it, you know, in some other context, and before you know it, you have to go to the government to get a license before you can run a blog. But I can't quite imagine it getting to that point. You know, the alternative is that we don't have the privilege for anyone in the federal courts, and I don't think that's a very attractive alternative.
If you'd like.
Okay. Actually, when all of us are so dissatisfied with the state of the credibility of the media, not just in this country, in most places really, and Jonathan can attest to the polarization in the media, and a lot of people are frustrated by that. As a matter of fact, I read about a poll that says that 51% of Americans don't like the media or distrust the media. They in fact think that the media is more a problem to the policy than even money itself. All right? So, and the fairness doctrine, for example, is no longer in place. And people are also wishing that this thing come back in terms of trying to moderate the tone, especially within the political discourse. You know, Fox, MSNBC, all of us are familiar with what's going on in these two entities. Opinionated journalism, all right? So I also listened to Hannity actually admit that he's not a journalist, he's a political hack. Now, but a lot of people don't know the difference between journalism and such political hacks, right? So will you comment in how perhaps really identifying who is a journalist could help in really in revamping the credibility of the media?
You know, it's a great question, and you have, I think, usefully made it more complex in an important and good way. And the Shield Law makes it more complex also. But I think if we're going to err on the side, on one side or the other, we should err on I'd rather have a too broad definition of who a journalist is than a too narrow definition of who a journalist is. Because in our you know, our ultimate objective is to inform the public, and you're going to risk informing the public less if you have too narrow of a definition, especially in countries that have a more rickety, a more fragile tradition of press freedoms. You know, then it's in those countries, and that doesn't include the United States, that I get more worried about the narrow definition, because I think it just becomes another means of government control or the control of elites on the flow of information.
So the Shield Law is not necessarily, you don't view the Shield Law as any kind of control. But don't forget that we are talking about self-regulation rather than perhaps maybe government-imposed regulation. So would you, will you support self-regulation probably imposed either in-house by some media organizations or by any other institution other than the government? Yeah, we all abhor government intrusion into the media in any shape or form. But at the same time, can we not really censor ourselves, or rather regulate ourselves in such a way that we become more credible? Because I'm sure every professional is worried about the integrity and the credibility of the media, or even the practitioners themselves. So what ways can we really change the perception?
Okay, just to give you an example, I think this is a hugely important issue because, the tradition of professions, as they become more professionalized, as they do more self-regulation. But when it's journalism, that self-regulation does become a kind of self-censorship. And we had a big debate about 25 years ago. It was before I spent 10 years covering the media for Newsweek. We had a big debate about something called the National News Council, which existed in this country and was similar to some of the institutions that you have in Nigeria. And it was, where if there was a story that was in question, this is in the 70s and early 80s, you'd go before, an august panel of people from the New York Times or retired New York Times editors and people from Columbia Journalism Review, and they would adjudicate kind of, almost like a legal proceeding on the accuracy of a story. That world has been obliterated by technology. And it couldn't be sort of more irrelevant as a process, even if it were to continue to exist. So, and it also, I'm not sure it really made for better journalism. So to me, the way to police and regulate is with more journalism, not with quasi-regulatory bodies or credentialing organizations or other ways of keeping people out. It's to say, from the top of our lungs, Rush Limbaugh, you're not a journalist. You're a clown. You're not a journalist. And to use, whatever voice we have, which can be considerable, to go after those who are either using shoddy journalism or are not journalists or pretending to be journalists, and to do it that way. Now, it's a losing struggle right now. It sort of looks like as almost anybody can call themselves a journalist, but I think it's too late for us to superimpose some kind of a structure and say you're not a journalist unless you have a degree from these universities. It can't be a fly-by-night university, it can't be this, can't be that. I mean, I think that it's too late for that, and it wasn't a good idea in the first place.
And I think this also raises an issue that we frequently bump into and usually avoid, and that is whether what we do is a profession. And I think it is not. I think in a lot of casual conversation, we hear journalism referred to as a profession. It's not, I think, for the reasons that Jonathan just outlined, but we are in a business where we went to college, most of us. We don't get our fingers dirty, although we do work with our hands. And we do something that we're passionate about, but I usually refer to it as a craft. I think a lot of people do, and it is not one. It just doesn't meet the specifications of a profession the way we normally think of a profession.
Thank you. I should also point out, if any of you have heard of the Diaspora Media Initiative, which helps to educate journalists from authoritarian countries on the traditions of the United States, that's also at CMPI. So Dr. Ekwo is negotiating this question really from both ends. Our next presenter, we're going to switch gears entirely. We're not going to talk about the Shield Law, but we are going to talk about who is a journalist. Tara Williams, you can see her credits up on the screen. I used to have a business card in my wallet, said I was a journalist. Now my business card says I'm a writer, because I'm more employable when it says I'm a writer. Tara has been a member in good standing of SPJ. She called me, I'm membership director. She called me last spring and she said, Bob, I'm really torn about this, but I think I have to resign from SPJ. I said, well, Tara, but you've been so active. And she says, well, I just took a job in PR because I have kids and, I need to. I said, Tara, if we excommunicated every member who took a job in PR, but we had a very good discussion. She very introspective, critical self-examination. 30 years ago, you went into PR in your 40s. It was the payoff. It was the sweet smell of success, right? Now a lot of us, well, I'm going to let Tara talk about this. Tara works on both sides, and she has a question.
Glad I wore heels. So my question is, I mean, what are your thoughts on folks who work on editorial going over to the dark side of PR and moving back and forth, given the disruption of the publishing, the newspaper industry? I mean, from an ethical standpoint and so forth.
In government, we call those government relations people. And if you look at many of the departments of New Jersey state government, the government relations person is a former newspaper reporter. That's where many of the people who, as downsizing has taken place in the news industry, actually end up working. And I dare say most of the government relations folks I know, again, in the administrative portion of New Jersey government, are former newspaper reporters. So they're supposedly come with the skills, since they were on the questioning side of how to sell their agency or give the best public face to whatever the business of that particular department of government might be.
So just quickly, Senator, a question. What are the consequences of that in Trenton? In other words, you've got a combination of fewer reporters who are covering Trenton, more government relations people who are expert at spin to make their
Or
agencies look good.
legislative
Liaison, whatever you would call them. As a result, less information about what's really going on in state government, or the same?
Yeah, no, much less. And I, as a public official who believe in a robust and free press, feel that. I feel it in the lack of in-depth reporting, in the hurry-up of, there was a public session, and the story has to appear within 3 minutes after somebody just spoke, and it very often is wrong, incorrect, given at least from my point of view, the wrong angle. So there has been a tremendous loss in the coverage of government, and Heather is kind of shaking her head yes over there, because we are working together on making our Open Public Records and Open Public Meetings Act much more robust, working with the Press Association, by the way. But yes, it's a terrific loss. It's a loss for government and for the citizens.
But if there are not as many people to dig into those records, then the new good laws
That's exactly
might
right.
not mean very much. The blogs aren't filling the gap at all, or a little bit? The
Very little.
blogs on state government?
The what?
The blogs
No.
that might cover
They-
state government?
They're too much in a rush to get the story online. This quick, we have, I could vote on a bill on the floor of the Senate and then pull up one of the blogs. Immediately after pushing my red or green button, go on the blog and see a story about it. That certainly nobody has had the opportunity then to really understand the ramifications of whatever it was we might have just done.
It's rather scary.
At the
It
local
is.
level, I've seen what I call news by press release. So now you have all these reporters that work for government, and the newspapers will publish like a Board of Freeholders press release word for word.
Yeah.
Is that, I would rather have a citizen journalist take on it than just giving me the party line all the way in the printed press, and then it's published as news when it's really written by a PR person for the local government agency.
But this isn't Tara's fault. Let's not blame Tara. She
No,
asked
that's-
the question.
Hey.
She's standing over there as though she's, responsible for.
I worked in the financial services industry, so I was on the dark side, and a lot of the issues that came up and destroyed our global economy, I'm not going to be, a direct, I'm not going to raise my hand and say, yeah, I was responsible for killing the economy, but, and making policy. But, I mean, on the PR side of things, I worked with some really good reporters and producers to neutralize some of the issues that we all know about, that people are still dealing with. And I think in a way that sort of, I'm less naive now, a lot more cynical, and hopefully a little smarter about things on the corporate side. and I'm not making a direct correlation here, but so I feel guilty to some degree as a former PR person working in financial services. And am I trying to redeem myself by being on more of the editorial side now? I don't know, but,
See, I don't
Well,
think
we
there's
can,
any-
we
Go
can
ahead.
help you with your confusion and on some sofa somewhere for
Yes.
amateur shrinkdom. But
Yeah.
we're trying to, at our university and many others, professionalize public relations. It's an important profession. It involves getting the word out about government programs, and you might look at the front page of any newspaper today and see what a poor job government, in the case of healthcare, has done in getting its message across to the multiple constituencies affected by it. So we think public relations is important, whether it's in the public or private sector. And at some level, I'd like to believe that people with journalism training going into it and treating it as a respected, important profession is in the public's good, and certainly in the good of communication between media and the entities it covers. So I don't consider it the dark side. I don't consider it an evil. I hope it's in the good of professionalizing a business, PR, whose reputation is as bad or even worse in some cases than that of journalism.